what I'm going to talk about is not the national return to early childhood education, but the return to a state and local economy from early childhood education. What does Indiana get out of investing in early childhood education? If you're in some local labor market somewhere, which presumably you all are, you live somewhere, what would be the return to your local economy from investing in early childhood education, and why would that occur? The basic argument is that these programs, I've spent most of my career studying local economic development programs, things like business tax incentives, property tax abatements, things like that. Investment tax credits, job creation tax credits. That's what people usually think of when they think of economic development. And that can work. It can work by attracting business and creating good jobs directly. But you can also create good jobs indirectly by enhancing the quality of your local workforce. And both those approaches can attract good jobs and do what we want from economic development. After all, we don't just want to create jobs. We want to raise per capita earnings in our local economy. We want higher employment to population ratios. We want higher wage rates. And we can either do it by working on the labor demand side with business tax incentives and other business climate policies, or we can do it by working on the labor supply side by working on the quality local workforce. Now, I want to emphasize there are a large number of things you can do to work on the quality of your local workforce. It's not just early childhood, but early childhood is something we know how to do, we know works. It works in affecting local economy in two ways. One is by the children who are involved in these programs end up growing up and being more productive adults. And in fact, if you look at the data, Americans aren't as hypermobile as some people sometimes think. 60 to 70% of all Americans will spend most of their working career in the state in which they spent their early childhood. In a metro area level, 40 to 50% of all Americans will spend most of their working career in the metro area where they spent their early childhood. Now, that means that although if Indiana invests in early childhood, some people, for some strange reason, will move to Michigan, which is where I'm from, or Ohio, or Washington, D.C., or Seattle, most, in fact, will stay in Indiana. And there's such a large return to these investments that it pays off at the state and local level. In addition, there's a very great return to these programs from their effects on parents. The child care provided by these programs enables parents to work, enables them to go back to school. Both those things enhance skills, enhance long-term earnings, even after the free child care is over. So what you find is that per dollar invested in your state or local economy in these programs, you get a rate of return in the form of higher per capita earnings that has a present value. Present value is just an economic term of we have this stream of earnings returns over the next 40 or 50 years. We have to somehow convert them into today's dollars, and we discount them back to the present. And what we say is that the present value of all those returns discounted back to when we invest, we get $5 to $9 for every dollar we put into them. For a typical state, investing in universal preschool for all 4-year-olds, each dollar you put in would increase per capita earnings, the present value per capita earnings over the next 40 years, by about $9. For comprehensive high-quality child care from birth to age 5, which is similar to the EduCare program that the Buffett Family Foundation promotes. It's the Abercetarian program in North Carolina, very similar to that. For every dollar you invest, you get about $6. Parenting programs, Nurse Family Partnership Program, where nurses work with young, first-time, low-income parents. Every dollar invested is about $5. And just for a comparison basis, I've done a lot of studies of business tax incentives over the years. A very well-designed business tax incentive program, for every dollar you invest, might increase the present value per capita earnings in a state economy by about $3. Now, at the national level, the returns are even greater. So all these returns are throwing away. What we're saying here, when Indiana invests, This is only counting the people who stay in Indiana. We're throwing away all those idiots who moved to Michigan or Ohio. We're just throwing that out. So from a national scale, the returns are even higher for Indiana's investment. But let's say you don't believe me or you're skeptical. Or the point is, even if you're not skeptical, there are a lot of skeptics out there. So let me talk about some of the skeptical arguments. So one issue is, why do we even know any of this stuff? Well, it turns out in the case of early childhood, although from a social standpoint, it's kind of unfortunate that we have limited access to these programs, from a research standpoint, that's great. Okay? Not every kid gets to these programs. And in fact, we've had several really well done randomized controlled trials looking at these programs. The most famous of which is probably Perry Preschool, Ypsilanti, Michigan, done originally in the 1960s. They've been annoying these poor kids, now adults. They're through age 40. I think they're going to keep on going. So they answer annoying questions every few years about their lives and how they're doing. Perry Preschool increased earnings 19%. The Abecedarian program I mentioned in North Carolina, which is very similar to the EduCare program, increased his earnings about 26%. Remember, that's a 5-year free child care, birth to age 5. Infant Health and Development program, which is another child care with a little bit of preschool in it, 12%. Nurse Family Partnership program also shows some large effects. In the case of the Abecedarian and the Nurse Family Partnership program, there are also very, very large earnings benefits for parents. I'll come back to this. Actually, for Abecedarian, the present value of the earnings effects for parents are 150% of the present value of the earnings benefits for kids. So actually it has larger effects on earnings for the parents than it does for the kids. The Abecedarian program, free child care from birth to age 5 for kids in poverty would be worthwhile even if it had no effect on kids. Zero effect on kids. It would pay off from a benefit standpoint even if the kids were unaffected by it. We also have some good studies that have looked at, there aren't experiments, but they're kind of natural experiments. So we've done studies of Head Start where we looked at 2 siblings in the same family, one of whom went to Head Start, one of whom didn't. What did we find? Earnings higher by 11%, sibling who went to Head Start. Chicago Child Parent Center study is a program that was run in Chicago for a number of years. It had some neighborhoods that had the program, some neighborhoods that did not have the program. Effect on adult earnings about 8%. And North Carolina was already mentioned earlier. North Carolina has a program called More at 4, which was rolled out in different counties at different times. And the test score effect shows effects of about 11%. We also have many studies done in numerous places, including Kalamazoo. I participated in the Kalamazoo and Tulsa studies that look at test scores of kids entering kindergarten and how they're affected by preschool. And those effects essentially do things by studying kids close to the age cutoff for kindergarten. So you study one kid just entering preschool who's just missed the cutoff, another kid who's just entering kindergarten who was in a year of preschool who just made the cutoff. These are 2 kids who are basically apart in age by like 3 days. And one kid's been through a year of preschool, one hasn't. What do you find? Their test scores are much higher than the kid who has not done preschool yet. And you would predict, based on those test score effects, adult earnings effects of 6 to 15%. By the way, the high end, and it varies by way across these programs, the highest effects is found in Boston, 15%. One other criticism of mine here is, won't all these effects fade if the K-12 system isn't good? Well, I'm not arguing you don't need to have a good K-12 system and that it wouldn't help to have a good K-12 system so these things could synergize and interact. Yes, you want to have a good K-12 system. That would help. On the other hand, I'd point out the Chicago Child Parent Center program was operated in neighborhoods where essentially 100% of the kids went to Chicago public schools. That program increased earnings by 11%. So I don't know what you think of Chicago public schools, with all due respect to Chicago Public Schools, I think there are some problems there. It's not a perfect school system, as far as I know. It has challenges. And despite that, those kids gain from preschool 11% earnings as adults. The other thing to note is that one very interesting finding from numerous studies of early childhood programs, and this graph shows this, is fading followed by recovery. That is, it is very common that if you test kids at the end of the program or when they enter kindergarten, and you give them various literacy and math tests, and you ask yourself, based on studies of how test scores are correlated with adult earnings, what earnings effects would you predict based on those entering kindergarten test scores? So you can do that, and you come up with numbers for these different programs. And then you go along and you test the kids around 3rd grade. What do you find? You almost always find some fading, sometimes 50%, sometimes 70%, sometimes 90%. And by fading, I mean that if you take the 3rd grade test scores, the differential between the treatment and control group, you would predict much lower effects on adult earnings. And in fact, the preschool looked like a total failure at the 3rd grade follow-up. You would have predicted this is a worthless program. We stuck all this money into these kids. We did 2 years of preschool, small class size, trained teachers. Failure, 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 failure. Yet, years later, this huge effect on earnings. Some people might say, why should I put my tax dollars to helping other people's children? What's in it for me? Well, there are several things that are in it for you. So let's talk about enlightened self-interest. I'm an economist, so I'm very comfortable talking about self-interest. And what's in it for me? Well, you might care about it. Even if you think your kid's fine with your resources and your parenting and whatever preschool you can afford to put them in, you might be concerned about peer effects in school, which are there, and every parent knows it, and the research supports the fact there are peer effects. You might want the other kids to maybe have fewer issues so that the teacher can spend more time with your kid, right? So that's one thing. We also know there are going to be fiscal effects. There are going to be effects on crime later on. The judge mentioned that earlier. You might not want to be mugged by one of those other people's kids you didn't want to invest in. There's also fiscal effects. Some of them are immediate, like lower special ed cost. Others are long-term, lower prison cost, higher tax revenue, lower welfare. Basically, the studies suggest, you can do different studies, high-quality preschool, high-quality early childhood programs probably reach the fiscal break-even point after somewhere between 10 and 25 years. But what I want to stress actually today is more the economic spillover effect. Okay, this is a chart based on various studies, and this Jeff kind of got to this earlier on. There are huge spillover effects of skills in the labor market. So there are a number of studies showing that your wage rate, what you are paid, depends not only on your education level, but on the average education level of the local labor market you live in. So that's interesting. And in fact, the effects are so strong that if we look at the effects of increasing college graduation rates, that these spillover effects appear to be greater than the direct effects. So what this chart says is, what if we take 1% of the population, and we increase the college graduation rate by 1% of the overall population? So for that 1%, it raises earnings by 80%. What does that do to overall average earnings? Well, we divide 80% by 100. It raises overall average earnings by 0.8%. What do we actually observe, though? We observe in local labor market data that when we raise the percentage of the local population that has a college degree by 1%, earnings actually goes up by 1.9%. There's a 0.8% direct effect. There is a 1.1% spillover effect. Now, obviously, the people who gain the most are the ones who get the college education, but there is a general increase in average real wages when we increase skills. The economy is not a zero-sum game where we're all competing for a fixed number of jobs. It's a positive-sum game in which we're trying to grow the overall pie, and part of that occurs through us interacting with each other through the skills we have or don't have. Another argument you sometimes hear is, okay, this is all long-term stuff. Who cares about the short term? Who cares about the long term? You know, the long term we're all dead, as Keynes famously said. So 40 years from now, so what? Well, first of all, someone needs to care about the long term. Secondly, there are some immediate benefits to these programs. As I mentioned, in the case of the Abecedarian program, the benefits for parents actually exceed those for kids, quantitatively. I mean, there are benefits for both groups, but the child care benefits in terms of increasing the parents' not just short-term earnings due to the child care, but what you find the follow-ups that even after the 5 years of free child care are over, their earnings are higher like 10 years, 15 years later, okay? Because they could go back to school, they could do more work, they acquire skills both ways. Also, there are some short-term benefits from special ed costs, which are lowered by, depending on the study, between 20% and 80%. Now, you get into arguments over, in some studies they suggest it might even be the case that you could pay for pre-K with special ed cost savings. I wouldn't count on that if I were designing financing for these programs, but it certainly would help. And the final thing I'm going to mention, I've done some studies of what would the effect of high-quality pre-K have on property values if all parents fully understood what it did to their kids' earnings? And the answer is we would expect that a high-quality universal pre-K program offered in a community should raise property values by about 5%. That's about what parents should be willing to pay for a house. For two identical houses, they should be able to pay 5% more for an identical house, identical neighborhood, except there's high-quality universal pre-K in the neighborhood versus a high-quality, similar house, similar neighborhood, but no universal high-quality pre-K. Now, is that occurring now in the housing market? I'm not sure it's really occurring now in the housing market. Will it eventually occur in the housing market? Yes, it will. I think parents are starting to figure this out. And I think these things will get bid into property values. And that's an immediate benefit for local governments and also benefit for homeowners, for property owners. But if the programs are high quality, they can pay off not just for the nation, which is what Heckman and people like that are trying to address, but for a state or local economy. In my view, if you're going to try to change the politics of this, one of the keys is enlisting the business community. Now, why is that? Well, because if all you're talking to is the early child educators, the K-12 people, the social workers, and with all, you know, and the so-called usual suspects, that's simply not a sufficient political coalition to pass these things. I mean, in order for this to occur, it has to be something that when the Indiana business community goes to the legislature and says, here are the key items on our agenda for this legislative session, that significant investments in early child education are among the key items they're listing. The way I put it is, this is a good thing we know how to do, and therefore, we should do it.
What can businesses do right this moment to impact this?
I think they need, I think, as I said, I think what businesses can do is either be engaged, or both, at the state level or at the local level. I don't really know. Okay, so I'm not an expert. I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I know something about Michigan politics. I know something about politics. I don't really know Indiana politics in any deep way, or even a shallow way, frankly. But I would think that you might have some influence over what your statewide Chamber of Commerce does. And presumably, you have influence at the local level. And there are learning coalitions at the local level and around the state. Get engaged with them, participate in them, find out what they're trying to do. What are they trying to do? Are they trying to increase quality in local programs? What funding do they need for that? Are they trying to, provide additional slots in either preschool or childcare that are affordable and high quality and providing scholarships for that or whatever? What funding do they need for that? Is there a need, is there interest in having the local school district do something in this regard, or the local county or local government? I mean, local governments have addressed preschool in a number of places, San Antonio, Kansas City, some in Denver, New York, obviously. Bloomberg got a lot of publicity for that. So things can be done by city government, by local governments. Now, what I don't know exactly what can you do if you're in a rural county with limited tax base. That's a different issue. But I think you need to find out what the local needs are. And then in addition, the question is, what kind of support can you give in other ways? Companies, if they're of sufficient scale they can afford this, can talk about how can we help address our employees' child care needs. I could go on and on, but there are many, many things companies can do.
Clearly, Indiana has a great opportunity to make a difference in our economy and communities by investing in our youngest Hoosiers.